Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos.
Picture a city after midnight, windows glowing, streets hushed under a glaze of street lamps. A man steps from the shadow of a doorway with the posture of someone who never hurries, yet never waits. His suit fits, but it isn't the suit you notice. It's the way conversations around him cool by a few degrees, the way eyes shift away before meeting his. By the time he reaches the corner, his name has already gone ahead of him. Some speak it with respect, some with worry, some not at all. He does not rush to be seen. He lets rumors do that heavy lifting. Paperboys will call that name in headlines for decades. Policemen will form task forces around it. Judges will hear it float through courtrooms like a chill draft. When he is old, that name will become the name of a whole organization. And yet he begins like so many others. One suitcase, $10, a crowded tenement, and a promise to his family that he would never be poor again. This is the long, winding road of Vito Genovese. He first opened his eyes in 1897 in a village near Naples, where stone walls held the sun and olive trees cast thin shade over hard soil. In those streets, children learned to listen before they learned to speak. His family worked with their hands, and when money tightened, the Atlantic looked like a chance. In 1913, barely a teenager, he boarded a ship and landed where many Italians landed then, Lower Manhattan, in rooms where 5 shared a bed in shifts and supper, stretched behind a closed door so the neighbors wouldn't notice there wasn't much of it. He learned English on stoops, and in alleys, discovered fast that a boy could walk a whole day and still end up short of rent. The neighborhood had its own traffic signals. A nod meant safety, a shrug meant a debt, a half smile meant trouble. He did small jobs, odd jobs, anything that paid in coins. Before long, those jobs edged into errands that walked the line between legal and not. Police records later described an early arrest for carrying a pistol and another brush with the law over stolen goods. He was not the only one. The docks, the pushcarts, the boarding houses everywhere, hunger taught shortcuts. He also learned discretion. You paid attention, spoke as little as possible, and remembered who favored who. When Prohibition started in 1920, whole blocks changed overnight. Alcohol didn't disappear, it just moved indoors and downstairs. Men who had barely managed suddenly bought cars. Warehouses whispered. Trucks rolled at odd hours. If you had nerve, if you had friends, and if you didn't boast, you could build something big out of something illegal. Vito fell in with a crew tied to Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, who ran rackets with a heavy hand, and through that circle he met younger men who would define the era. Charles Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and others who believed in business first, ethnic boundaries second. He didn't bark orders or play for applause. He listened, leaned in, and when it was time to decide, he decided once. That quality, cool and final, earned him standing. He made money in bootlegging, protection, and gambling rooms. Work that brought cash in thick bundles, and risk in thicker ones. Truck routes had to be guarded. Cases had to be paid for in advance. Speakeasies wanted dependable supplies. A crew that moved well could become a network, and a network could become an empire. He rose as an earner and a fixer, someone who could steady a quarrel and also settle it, and not many people wanted to study the difference too closely. By the late 1920s, the city's underworld looked like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by deals and shredded by grudges. Italians from different regions kept their own customs. Irish and Jewish outfits controlled large pieces of the bootleg market. The smartest young men started to cross those lines, forming alliances that put profit ahead of old country feuds. Vito aligned with Luciano, Costello, and others who believed the underworld could be reorganized like a corporation. Divisions for gambling, liquor, labor rackets, and loans. Rules for avoiding open warfare, a preference for persuasion over spectacle. It was idealistic in its own criminal way, and it needed one thing to become real: the end of the old guard. The so-called Castellamarese War boiled across 1930 and 1931, pitting Masseria against Salvatore Maranzano, two bosses from a generation that prized absolute rule. The fighting wasn't trench warfare. It was stops and starts, whispers and disappearances, a pressure that never lifted. According to many law enforcement files and later testimony, Vito stood with Masseria at first, as did Luciano. But Masseria distrusted the reforms his younger men wanted. They believed the street wars bled money and invited heat. If they could remove the men who kept those wars alive, they reasoned, they could stabilize everything else. On an afternoon in April 1931, Joe Masseria met his end at a restaurant in Coney Island. Accounts differ on the final minutes, and the men who knew the exact details stayed careful in courtrooms. Many historians, news accounts, and police reports name Vito among those close to the scene, though evidence was never tested in a trial. What is not disputed is what came after. Maranzano immediately tried to crown himself the single ruler. For a few months that summer, he was treated as the final say on disputes. Then he made a mistake that shifted the ground under his feet. He began listing which younger leaders should be eliminated to preserve his personal power, and Luciano's name appeared on that list. In September 1931, Maranzano fell to an attack in his office, a swift action credited by investigators to Luciano's faction, with Vito aligned on the winning side. Out of those two deaths came a new structure. The top families in New York and beyond formed a committee to handle disputes and protect business. Newspapers later called it a commission. Out of the Masseria group, Luciano rose as boss, and he installed Vito as his underboss, a rank that gave him authority over strategy, alliances, and discipline. They diversified. Gambling rooms kept busy. Labor rackets grew at the waterfront and in the garment district. Bookmaking took bets from uptown to the Bronx. In each corner, Vito made sure that payments arrived when due and that disputes were handled quietly. He did not pretend to live clean. He simply insisted on control. He liked meetings at quiet restaurants where a waiter he trusted could set down a plate and vanish. He preferred associates who stayed out of newspapers. Those who crossed him tended to fade out of the picture. Some of those disappearances were chalked up in police ledgers as suspected homicides. In interviews decades later, former mob figures described him as careful, calculating, and cold, a man who could talk calmly about a baseball game and then instruct someone to deal with an obstacle, leaving the method unsaid but understood. Meanwhile, law enforcement grew more effective. Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey targeted big figures who had once seemed untouchable. In 1936, Dewey secured the conviction of Luciano on charges tied to a large prostitution network. Vito's role in that case was as a leader inside the broader organization. He was not indicted in that prosecution, but its outcome changed his life. With Luciano imprisoned and eventually deported, Vito's influence grew. He moved to act as the top executive inside the family during a turbulent moment when rivals smelled opportunity. Even as he consolidated control, an older case was coming to a boil. In 1934, a gambler named Ferdinand the Shadow Boccia had been killed. 2 years later, prosecutors alleged Vito had ordered that hit after a dispute over money. In 1937, facing indictment for that killing, he chose flight over a courtroom. He left New York and returned to Italy. A dramatic move that suggested he understood exactly how much risk he faced. The Boccia case would trail him for years, and the witness list included Peter Latempa, a man with enough knowledge to trouble any defense. Latempa would later die under suspicious circumstances, while in protective custody, a death that inflamed public speculation and has long been associated with Vito's reach, though a court never proved who was behind it. Italy in 1937 felt very different from the New York he had left. The fascist regime was loud, organized, and visible in uniforms, posters, and parades. Vito settled in the Naples area, purchased property, and, according to wartime investigative files, became a figure who could smooth arrangements in the black market. He made introductions, interpreted, and found ways to turn scarcity into profit. He did not carry a banner for ideology. Money was his preferred flag. He made friends where influence could be traded. Local officials, businessmen, and fixers who operated between the letter of the law and the needs of the day. Though a continent away, he kept a hand on the levers in New York through intermediaries. Messages moved through letters, travelers, and coded remarks. He had a talent for delegation, choosing men who could manage day-to-day operations without pulling police attention. His name still controlled rooms, yet distance had costs. New faces were rising in the American underworld, ambitious, tough, and eager to claim territory. Some swore loyalty to him, others pledged to rivals. New York did not pause when someone left. It reshuffled and kept moving. Life in Italy exposed Vito to yet another shift when war broke over Europe. Allies and Axis forces fought across the peninsula. In 1943, when Allied troops reached southern Italy, old authorities fell, and new ones took their place overnight. Vito presented himself to American military officials as a useful intermediary who spoke both languages and understood local customs. In those months, he helped military officers establish contacts and restore basic services. Meanwhile, American investigators dug into reports that he had been enriching himself through black market deals, arranging supplies and favors for profit while the region reeled from conflict. Those competing portraits, an interpreter helping the occupying administration, and a racketeer taking advantage of chaos both attached themselves to his name. The heat from New York had not cooled. American law enforcement, still holding an indictment over the Boccia killing, pushed for his return. Military intelligence officers began to view him with suspicion. The winds changed. He was arrested by U.S. authorities in Italy in 1944 and brought back across the ocean to face the old charge at last. The stage seemed set for a decisive courtroom chapter, but the case, the witnesses, the politics of the moment, it all wobbled. La Tempa, who might have told a story that jurors would not forget, was gone. Without that crucial testimony, prosecutors saw their strongest pillars crack. In 1946, the Boccia indictment was dismissed, and Vito walked free, proof again that timing, patience, and luck can weigh as much as anything inside a courtroom. He returned to a New York that had changed, and had not changed. Broadway lights still glittered, and back rooms still hummed. The men in charge wore different suits, but the jobs remained. Control the unions that controlled the docks, keep the bookmaking numbers straight, watch the markets for produce, garments, and construction, and always keep an eye on City Hall, where a timely contribution or a friendly handshake could prevent trouble before it started. He set about arranging his base again, renewing old alliances and measuring new ones. Those years cemented the qualities that made people describe him with a mixture of awe and wariness. He rarely raised his voice. He kept meetings brief. He believed loyalty should be rewarded bountifully and disloyalty punished decisively. Former associates later said he did not glow in the spotlight the way some contemporaries did. He preferred to flow around it. If you were close to him, you knew where power lived. If you weren't, you might never see him at all. Newspapers still found his name, though, and printed it above the fold when any tremor rippled through the underworld. Behind the scenes, the story of his influence is also the story of the city. Longshoremen wondered who really ran the piers. Gamblers passed envelopes down a chain that ended in rooms they never entered. Politicians weighed favors. Honest shopkeepers sometimes paid to avoid mysterious problems with deliveries and inspections. Workers on night shifts traded rumors about who decided which trucks got the best routes. Families in clustered apartments heard the radio news and lowered their voices for the next hour. The underworld touched everyday life in 100 small, unseen ways, and Vito sat near the levers that moved those gears. He knew that a reputation can open a door before a knock. He also knew that reputation can draw a detective's lamp. He was cautious in speech, formal in his routines, and relentless about security. He chose restaurants with back exits. He rotated drivers. He kept his circle tight, his schedule flexible, and his temper under glass. For him, the safest meeting was the one nobody noticed happened. The business he led depended on calm more than bravado, consistency more than spectacle. In that sense, his quiet was louder than any newspaper headline. Years earlier, when he had left for Italy, people thought his American chapter might be closed. Now he was back, and the city recognized a familiar presence, sharper and more practiced. He had survived a courtroom scare and a war. He saw that the board had been reset. What remained was the same game. Make money, keep trouble distant, and outmaneuver rivals who studied the same playbook. If history tends to favor those who move first, Vito preferred to move second after he had watched the room and measured every handshake. Plenty of people in those days told their children that the world was changing quickly. In truth, parts of it had always been like this, changing and unchanged at once. In the morning, workers set out with lunch pails. In the evening, radios told jokes and announced scores. And somewhere above the din, a man with a calm expression sifted through ledger lines that meant more than most voters would ever know. He had started as a boy with nothing to spare. Now, as the 1940s drew to a close, he looked up at a skyline where his influence threaded through neighborhoods like wiring behind a wall. He believed he would keep building, because he saw himself as inevitable, a man who could wait longer than anyone else in the room. For every person who shook his hand, there were 10 who hoped never to meet him. For every dollar he collected, there was a ripple that touched people who didn't know his name, except when it appeared on the front page. The city was still awake, and so was he, and he was not done. He came home from the courtroom storm to a city that had grown louder and richer since he'd left. Wartime money had swelled the streets. Neon was brighter, taxis busier, and the gossip better fed. Yet the rules he understood still ruled. The right table at the right restaurant could do more than any office. A nod from an old friend in a corner booth could restart a machinery of favors that had only paused, never stopped. He slipped back into that current with the calm of someone who believed he had only stepped out for air. He knew which doors opened for quiet men, and which ones stayed shut for anyone who asked twice. Frank Costello had stewarded the organization during the years Vito was gone, and he had done it with a politician's touch. He preferred soft power. Judges who answered the phone, ward leaders who answered a question with a favor, union officials who never needed to be told twice. He shaped policy rather than bragging about muscle, and newspapers dubbed him the Prime Minister. Vito respected the reach, but disliked the style. Costello favored steady income and low noise, built from gambling, bookmaking, and influence at City Hall. He discouraged narcotics, which attracted federal heat. Vito leaned toward a wider balance sheet. He wanted dividend streams everywhere. Construction, the docks, the garment district, vending machines, slot concessions, the jukeboxes, and he did not speak with the same caution when narcotics profits were discussed in private. That difference in appetite formed the fault line that would widen across the decade. He refreshed his circle with men who knew how to read a street without staring at it. Tony Bender-Strollo worked the downtown lanes and uptown rooms with equal comfort, a go-between who could make a message feel like a favor. Gerardo Jerry Cattina ran key interests in New Jersey, a patient manager of unions and routes whose ledger stayed neat. Mike Miranda kept a close hand on discipline and protocol, making sure rituals were observed and orders followed without repetition. In East Harlem, a heavy-set earner with an easy laugh named Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno took care of numbers and loans. He would become more visible later, but even now he drew steady cash from policy bets and Shylock loans. In Newark, Ruggiero, Richie the Boot, Boyardo anchored rackets that fed back to the same center. A lanky, intense young tough named Vincent Gigante, who boxed under the name The Chin, started showing up around Vito, playing courier, driver, and when needed, a persuader. Tom Eberly, smooth in a suit, handled introductions and leaned into new ventures. The crew had different ages, different temperaments, but one shared vocabulary: precision, loyalty, profit. He moved carefully at first. He visited restaurants where the waiters knew which blind to lower when the conversation turned serious. He held meetings that ended before the coffee cooled. He paid attention to who greeted him with warmth and who with politeness. The gap mattered. He built bridges where bridges would carry money and quietly placed pressure on joints that needed to bend. He did not lunge at Costello. He measured him. He counted which capos still preferred Costello's steady hand and which preferred Vito's colder math. He sensed that time could do more than shouting ever could. There was another stage where business was discussed, and it was not in Manhattan. In late 1946 and early 1947, Havana drew a parade of men whose names lit up clippings in police files. Gambling was legal there. Casinos ran bright and late. Hotel suites made good offices. Charles Lucky Luciano, deported, but still listened to, held court for a time. Accounts differ on exact seating charts and scripted speeches, but the story that has survived in memoirs, police summaries, and investigative reporting puts Vito in those rooms, pressing his argument that the future belonged to men willing to let profits travel through every channel, including heroin. Others in the room, especially those aligned with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, pushed a more cautious line. Long money, not hot money. U.S. Pressure on Cuba blew that meeting apart. Quickly, American officials arm-twisted Havana into sending Luciano away and clipped casino ambitions for a while, but the debate did not fade. It traveled back to New York, where it kept twitching under every conversation about who should steer the family and where it should go. Television came to the underworld the way water finds a leak. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Estes Kefauver ran hearings on organized crime. People who never thought they'd watch a Senate session found themselves glued to small screens as witnesses fidgeted, hedged, and reached for water, all in black and white. The hearings pulled mob names into living rooms, along with talk about bookmakers, slots, fixed contracts, and padded payrolls. Costello took the stand. Cameras caught his hands, his voice, his careful answers. That experience knocked some shine off his aura. In the same period, Willie Moretti, a Costello ally from New Jersey, grew erratic and loose-tongued, sick, and no longer reliable. He was killed at a restaurant in 1951, a slaying widely understood by law enforcement to be an internal decision to prevent further risk. The death removed a protector from Costello's flank and signaled how fragile that side had become. Vito did not crow, but the wind shifted in his favor. Money still had to be made every day, no matter what the newspapers printed. Vito's organization did it in lawful-looking ways that hid unlawful pressure. Trucks delivered produce only after routes were assigned by friends. Union cards were issued to workers who knew when dues were one thing and a private collection another. Vendors got the better corner if someone upstairs smiled. Slot machines appeared where the inspector didn't. A crooked broker steered city contracts toward companies that hired the right subcontractors. Along the Hudson, the waterfront moved under hands that preferred a nod to a memo. At the Fulton Fish Market, deliveries arrived early for those who met the right people. In the Garment Center, deliveries and pickups flowed along paths that made certain accounts preferred. It was 1,000 small tolls disguised as order. Pay, and life went smoothly. Resist, and a string of inconveniences might make the resistance feel expensive. Former longshoremen and trucking men later said that you couldn't always see the man at the top, but you could feel where he wanted the current to run. He also invested in things that could sit on any tax return with a straight face. Restaurants, bars, vending companies, moving firms, and small real estate parcels provided cover, influence, and cash. A jukebox route could mean a say in which songs played in 100 bars, which meant owners listened when a request came to host a meeting or extend a line of credit to an associate. A cigarette vending business could introduce collectors who also collected bets. A moving company could explain why a truck was parked along a particular curb at a particular hour. The legitimate did not erase the illegitimate. It disguised it. He continued to cultivate alliances beyond his own circle. Albert Anastasia, the head of another powerful family, and a man feared for decisive measures, controlled much of the Brooklyn waterfront through his brother Anthony, a labor leader. Anastasia's reputation for immediate solutions earned him both respect and resentment. Across town, Carlo Gambino played the long game, quiet, strategic, patient. Vito understood that Costello's softer model had made room for a different coalition. If you could put old-school enforcement and new-school planning behind you, you could move a whole board. Law enforcement later argued, and many historians agree, that by the mid-1950s, he was building exactly that kind of coalition, whispering to Gambino and others that the old arrangement needed to be replaced. Caution did not keep federal agents away. Subpoenas arrived, grand juries convened, and press shots showed him in a fedora walking into courthouses, lips sealed. He invoked his rights when questions became traps. Prosecutors tried income tax angles and perjury charges, the usual tools against men who never signed contracts for the work they actually did. A few lesser cases landed on his associates, pushing them south or out of sight. Vito responded by redistributing responsibilities. If a capo had to take a long vacation in Florida, another capo took over his rackets with a handshake and a promise to send envelopes on time. The enterprise adjusted without theatrics. Discipline stayed tight. Police files from the period also tied his influence to the narcotics traffic that grew in strength during those years. Heroin moved through ports, through apartments, through suitcases small at first, then larger. Vito did not pack bags himself. He made decisions about whether to tolerate, tax, or forbid a line of business. Many contemporaries, including later government witnesses, said he saw narcotics as a revenue stream too large to ignore. The choice pitted him against Costello's cautious policy and pulled new moneymen into his orbit, including couriers and brokers who moved in ethnic networks across Harlem, the Bronx, and New Jersey. Every dollar made carried risk, but Vito believed risks could be managed with structure and silence. By 1956, the standoff with Costello had aged past talking. Costello still commanded a wide fence of political friends and older capos who valued his restraint. But fear and greed make persuasive arguments, and Vito spoke both languages fluently. He made it known that he would not accept a permanent second seat. That message did not arrive on letterhead. It arrived in private conversations, where men weighed the benefits of picking the likely winner. He did not threaten. He promised stability under his plan, and he set about demonstrating that he had enough force to make that promise real. On an evening in May 1957, the city found out how far the split had gone. Frank Costello stepped out of a taxi and headed toward the lobby of his building on Central Park West. A young man waited near the elevators, and when Costello approached, a shot rang out. He fell, wounded but alive. A bullet had grazed his head. The gunman fled into the night. Police traced whispers toward the east side, and soon a name surfaced. Vincent Gigante, the lanky boxer who had been seen around Vito. Gigante turned himself in, and in a courtroom, mouthed a respectful line toward Costello, a strange mix of apology and irony that made headlines. The case stumbled. Costello declined to identify his shooter. The jury saw uncertainty. Gigante walked. But the message had traveled already. Costello announced that he was stepping back, and he did so without denouncing anyone. He valued survival over a title. The transition that Vito had worked toward quietly now moved openly. The attempted killing did more than clear a chair. It signaled that the center of gravity in New York's underworld was shifting from the old political way to a rougher calculus. People understood that a leader willing to sanction an attack on a figure as public as Costello would not be shy about disciplining anyone else. In the weeks after, men who had been undecided began to stop by the restaurants where Vito ate and gave their pledges. He accepted them with calm and with instructions. Keep the unions orderly, keep the money clean on paper, keep the heat down. He was not in it for applause. He was in it for control. Control did not mean isolation. He still needed cooperation across families to keep the money flowing and the streets from exploding. That meant making peace with men who had their own ambitions. Carlo Gambino, with his low profile and sharp mind, proved a natural counterpart. Albert Anastasia, however, was a problem. His family's enforcement past and his hold on the waterfront made him formidable. And his temper promised complications in an era when Vito wanted clean lines and quiet rooms. Investigators later pieced together a picture of meetings and understandings between Vito's camp and others who saw Anastasia as too volatile to last. Power arranged itself the way water finds downhill toward the path of least resistance. In the fall of 1957, Anastasia was shot in a midtown barbershop by men who were never conclusively identified in court. The scene shocked the city and embarrassed the police, who had not stopped one of the most public underworld killings in memory. In the immediate aftermath, Gambino took over Anastasia's family, which strengthened the bond between his organization and Vito's. To people watching from the outside, the map of influence had been redrawn without a single press release. If Vito looked calm during those weeks, it was because he thought the storm had passed. He had eased Costello aside, helped remove a volatile rival from another family's throne according to law enforcement's reconstruction of the period, and stood as the most forceful man in the city's criminal world. He expected to turn victories into structure, meetings into codified agreements, and territory into predictable income. He moved to crown this new order with a national gathering that would align policies from New York to Chicago to Buffalo and far beyond. The thought behind it was businesslike. Set standards, assign territories, and discourage rash acts that brought federal raids. The place chosen was quiet countryside. The guest list long. Men arrived in big cars, and small towns noticed. What followed would become one of the most famous fiascos in the history of American organized crime, an event that would make front pages, change investigations, and brand his leadership with a mark he could never quite wash away. It was not yet winter, but the air in upstate New York already had a bite to it. The big house with a wide lawn looked like a place for a family reunion, not a summit. Drivers parked in rows. A cook set out platters. Inside, talk spread. Narcotics rules, labor rackets, disputes between cities, commissions, and votes. Outside, a state trooper drove by and counted too many Cadillacs for one driveway. A local merchant called in what he'd seen. Radios crackled. Bad luck met bad timing. Before the coffee reached the third tray, the driveway filled with lawmen. The men inside bolted for the woods in expensive shoes, not meant for pine needles and mud. Photos later showed hats, suits, and briefcases scattered like props. A judge would shake his head on the bench and remind the country that there had never been a national syndicate. The pictures told a different story. Dozens were detained. Names that had lived in whispers were printed in lists. The raid at Appalachian, as it came to be known, exposed the network in a way no hearing had done. It turned Vito's attempt at structure into a parade of indictments and headlines. Prosecutors suddenly had a list of attendees to call before grand juries. Reporters had an easy way to explain to viewers that organized crime was not a fantasy. Politicians saw value in making shows of force. For Vito, the fallout was immediate and costly. He had wanted to be seen as a manager who could keep the peace and grow the pie. Instead, he was painted as the man who proved, by accident, that there was a pie at all. The anger inside his own world was real. Some felt he had drawn too much attention. Others thought fortune had simply turned. After Appalachian, pressure increased. Agents parked outside houses more often. Phones clicked more. Subpoenas thickened. Anyone connected to New York's families felt it. Vito met this pressure the way he met most things, with stillness. He moved some meetings farther from the city. He relied more heavily on out-of-town capos like Katina and Boyardo. He spoke less on the phone. He trusted face-to-face above everything, and he rewrote his calendar around that preference. He also redoubled efforts to keep bookmaking, union influence, and loans running without friction. If he could not erase the photographs of men running through the trees, he could at least show his people that their incomes would continue. Yet it was not reporters that would bring his next trial. It was a line of business that had been simmering for years, one he had embraced despite the noise it created. The federal government had begun to prioritize narcotics cases, using informants, wiretaps, and aggressive prosecutors to stitch together conspiracies that reached to the top. Men who had sold packets on corners were flipped. Couriers who had watched suitcases move from ship to car to apartment chose to sign statements. In the late 1950s, a series of arrests and debriefings in New York and Puerto Rico named figures tied to his organization. A man named Nelson Cantellops emerged as a central witness, telling agents about networks that carried heroin from overseas to Harlem and beyond, with payments flowing up in a pattern prosecutors argued was designed, not random. The picture that formed was not a street corner story. It was a map. In the months to come, indictments would follow, a courtroom would fill, and the question would shift from rumor to proof. The man who had crossed an ocean to dodge one murder case now faced a federal conspiracy case he could not ignore. The city still glittered outside the courthouse as always, but the mood was different. He had won big and lost big before, and he believed patience could beat any prosecution. This time the stakes had risen, and the circle around him had to decide, one by one, whether to hold firm under the light or step away before the heat got any closer. The indictment turned into a courtroom calendar, and the calendar turned into a daily march past cameras. The federal trial opened with a long list of co-defendants, stacks of exhibits, and a plan to explain an invisible network in plain speech. Jurors heard about coded calls, cash paid in stairwells, suitcases swapped at docks, and names that moved envelopes without leaving fingerprints. The government's case leaned on insiders who said they had carried packets, counted payments, and ferried messages. Among them, a courier named Nelson Cantellops described routes from the Caribbean to New York, middlemen who took a toll, and a line of profits that, in his telling, curved upward toward the defendant the press cared about most. The defense attacked credibility and motives, and reminded the jury that a witness who hoped for a lighter sentence could make any story sound neat. They asked where the documents were, where the recordings were, where the physical proof lived. The answer the government gave was that crime at that level rarely signed its name in ink. He sat through it with the same face he showed at restaurants, courteous, still, uninterested in drama. He wore good suits and said little. When he spoke to his lawyers, it was in whispers that barely moved his jaw. His team tried to turn every government witness into a man with a reason to lie. They pointed to contradictions, to nervous tics, to the way memory bends when the promise of freedom is dangled just beyond a raised hand. They reminded the jury that he had been a target for years, and that his name made easy headlines. The government responded with more witnesses, more diagrams, and a theme that stuck. This case wasn't about a single scene on a single street. It was about a structure. Newspapers loved the trial because it told a story people half believed, but rarely heard in detail. Inside the courthouse, though, the pace was slow. A month of direct examination and cross. A week on exhibits. A parade of agents who said they had followed cars, lifted address books, and built files thick enough to act as doorstops. When the judge finally delivered instructions, the jury had a narrative to weigh, a web of suppliers, runners, and brokers moving narcotics, with a leadership tier that taxed the business and protected it. The jury returned with guilty verdicts. When sentencing day came in 1959, the judge's tone was stern and precise. The punishment was heavy enough to look like a statement. He went off to federal custody to begin a term measured in years, not months. Going to prison did not cancel his influence. It shifted it. Atlanta's federal penitentiary took him in, a place built out of concrete, steel, and routines that didn't bend for anyone. He adapted by using the same habits he had honed on the outside. Keep a low profile, meet few people, trust fewer, and make sure any message that traveled was necessary and brief. Visits with lawyers became a channel for instructions that never used a name when a description would do. Associates visited and spoke carefully, leaving with favors to grant and lines to keep straight. He accepted that he could not meet in restaurants anymore, but he did not accept that he could not decide. On the street, the family adjusted around him. Michelle Mike Miranda, a man who cared about protocol, kept the structure tight. Gerardo Katina managed New Jersey interests and the industrial corridors where union ties meant leverage. Anthony Strollo, whose nickname Tony Bender came from his ability to get people to change their minds, handled delicate contacts. Tom Evil Eye grew more visible, smooth with introductions and comfortable making decisions that traveled. The aim was simple. Keep envelopes arriving on time, keep the waterfront and the market stable, keep bookmakers safe, and avoid public spectacle. This set up boss inside, lieutenants outside fit the times. The country had become conscious of the underworld in a new way after the upstate raid. Everyone understood that only quiet could preserve income. He filed appeals. He hired new lawyers. He argued that the government had leaned too hard on witnesses who told stories for personal gain. He asked for a new trial based on claims that testimony had been shaped, that the web painted by the prosecution looked too neat to be true. Some letters surfaced. One even had a witness suggesting that he had embroidered his tale under pressure. The courts listened, weighed the papers, and declined to undo the verdict. The conviction stood. He took the loss, with the unusual calm that had protected him for decades. When a judge said no, he did not rant. He adjusted the plan. Prison brought a different kind of pressure, the kind that grows in small spaces without windows. Rumors traveled faster than mail. Trust turned brittle. In 1962, a soldier in his own organization named Joseph Valakai snapped under that pressure. Convinced that a contract had been placed on him, and certain that he had been marked for removal by order of the boss, Valakai acted rashly in the yard and killed a fellow inmate he mistakenly thought was sent to end him. That crime brought a second life sentence. Facing a future that offered nothing but gray walls, he asked federal agents to listen. What followed reshaped public understanding of the underworld more than any court case of the prior decade. Valachie's debriefings became a book-length education for investigators. He diagrammed the organization he had served, described rights, ranks, and rules, and named bosses, including the man whose orders he believed still carried weight despite prison bars. He granted the public a vocabulary, Cosa Nostra, and a way to imagine the structure behind headlines. In 1963, 963, he sat before a Senate committee and, on live television, repeated the essentials for a national audience. Viewers watched a pale, nervous man tell senators that the underworld was not a rumor. It was organized, deliberate, and managed. He spoke of murders, oaths, and councils. He put names to the 5 families and called Vito the head of the one that carried his name. For the boss in Atlanta, those broadcasts were an insult and an annoyance, not a legal threat. He was already serving time on a narcotics conviction. The hearings didn't add charges, but they had effect. They reinforced the focus of federal agents. They encouraged new investigations into labor rackets, construction deals, and waterfront control. They taught jurors how to think about conspiracy. They made careful men feel watched again, and they cemented in the public mind a picture of him as the archetype of the modern mob leader, cool-faced and controlling. On the outside, the 1960s began to bend old routes. New York changed in visible ways. New buildings, new mayors, new laws, and in invisible ones too. Wiretaps became more common and more sophisticated. Grand juries were convened more often to pry open unions and trucking companies. Friends who had always returned calls now put certain numbers on hold. Yet the family endured, because it had been built to outlast jolts. Katina kept ledgers straight. Miranda enforced the line between what could be done and what must be avoided. Eboli shook hands, smiled for cameras when that was the smart play, and made sure the parts kept moving. In East Harlem and the Bronx, Anthony Salerno handled the numbers with the same low profile as always, taking in policy bets and sending proceeds up without delay. In Newark, Ruggiero Boiardo took care of the New Jersey side, cautious and rooted, often working through sons and trusted allies to keep machinery oiled. The hardest blow inside the organization in those early years did not come from a subpoena. It came from a disappearance. In April 1962, Tony Bender Strollo vanished after a late-night phone call drew him from his home. He had been a key broker, someone who knew which bridges to cross and which to burn. When he did not return, whispers started immediately. Some thought he was under suspicion for talking too freely. Others believed he had leaned too far toward Costello in earlier disputes, and that old resentments had ripened. Law enforcement files blamed the order on the boss, who now lived behind bars, citing informants who said the final word could travel even from a cell. No body was found. No charges were filed. The gap that remained was practical more than sentimental. A role had to be filled without creating ripples. He was moved at times for health and management reasons. Atlanta was the center, but he also saw Leavenworth briefly, and, as age took a toll, he was transferred for treatment to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. These were changes of scenery, not changes of habits. At each stop, he arranged the same small routines that had always steadied him. Quiet meals, short conversations, predictable walks. He adapted his schedule around visiting hours and legal consultations, and he preferred lawyers who understood how to carry a message without writing it down. He never abandoned the claim that the narcotics case had been built on unreliable voices. Now and then, a story in the papers revived the question, when a witness recanted and then unrecanted, or when an old agent's methods were questioned. He instructed his lawyers to keep pressing, to file where filings were possible, to request hearings when hints of misconduct surfaced. Judges, however, resisted the idea that the verdict had been a misunderstanding. The conviction held. He adjusted again, this time by setting the terms under which he would be a long-term inmate who remained a factor in the world he had helped organize. Running an enterprise from inside required more patience. It meant accepting that some decisions would be made on the street by men who were not always aligned on the fine points. Miranda's devotion to tradition sometimes slowed deals. Katina's conservatism kept lines clean but could frustrate younger earners. Eboli enjoyed the role of mediator and public face, which made some whisper that he liked the attention too much. The boss tolerated those differences because the totals still looked right. If money reached the right pockets in the right amounts, discipline could be maintained with reminders rather than explosions. He held to one rule that had guided him since youth. Punishment should be quiet. He never endorsed demonstrations that fed papers. If a collector took a cut he hadn't been granted, he would be replaced without speeches. If a union man got sloppy, he would be moved to a lesser job. If an associate ignored a boundary, he might find his access canceled and his calls unanswered. This method, based on shunning more often than spectacle, kept scenes out of the tabloids and income steady. It also lowered the risk of defection. A man eased out of a spot could be useful later. A man paraded in disgrace might look for a microphone. Events on other fronts mattered for his calculus. Carlo Gambino's rise after 1957 had created a new balance in New York. Gambino preferred a whisper to a shout, and that style meshed with the way Vito liked to do business. The two reputations together discouraged conflict. When disputes did break out over a truck route, a Shylock customer, a garment contract, the solution was usually a sit-down that ended with a math problem. Who had invested what? Who would pay whom? And how quickly? Violence was always a tool in reserve, but not the first tool. Everyone had learned from Appalachian that heat hurt everyone's bottom line. The long shadow of that upstate fiasco lingered through the decade. Prosecutors used attendance lists to pursue contempt cases. Tax agents used names from those lists to cross-check returns for sudden jumps in income that could not be explained by any W-2. City investigators tightened rules at the fish market, the docks, and the produce terminals. Each crack in the wall meant another layer of insulating fronts had to be built. More companies, cleaner invoices, better explanations for why a certain contract always seemed to land in the same hands. The family adjusted, often by stepping one business further away from direct control. Instead of holding a union card, a man might own a hauling company whose trucks happened to be the only ones that met a new safety standard. Instead of placing a relative on a city payroll, he might fund a local political club that, in time, could help a friendly candidate win a small office that influenced inspections. This was the long game, and he approved of long games. Not all accounts of the period came from enemies or prosecutors. Some came from defectors who had served for years and decided the institution had failed them. One of those, a small-time operative from his old neighborhood, went to the papers in the mid-1960s with a story that mixed fact, half-truth, and self-promotion. He painted himself as a messenger who had carried coded notes in matchboxes and in ties, and he claimed to have watched the leadership bicker over diamonds and drugs. That story sold copies but didn't add details investigators could act on. It did, however, reinforce a public image, a boss who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. Consequences for old informants continued to appear years after cases had closed. Ernest, the Hawk Rupolo, who had once given statements about the 1934 Boccia killing, was found dead in 1964 under circumstances that looked like payback, though the people responsible were never tried for it. Another earlier cooperator, Dominic Petrilli, had been deported to Italy and killed there after the war. These outcomes fed the feeling that time did not erase debts in that world. From a cell, the boss would have understood the message, even if he couldn't direct every echo. There were also moments that showed the limits of control. In one year, a strike at the docks began to spin out of hand, threatening a mayoral race by snarling shipments. He wanted calm because calm meant revenue. But the politics of the moment pulled unions into fights he had no interest in. It took weeks, and some concessions to steady the piers again. In another episode, a young crew in the Bronx fought over the rapid growth of after-hours clubs and jukebox placements, turning a business disagreement into a street rivalry that required older men to step in and impose a settlement. These small fires reminded everyone that the structure existed for a reason. Without it, quick money turned into quick trouble. Age tugged at him. A man who once walked New York blocks at midnight now measured days by counts and lights out. He kept himself formal, even in drab surroundings. He shaved carefully. He pressed his shirts as best he could. He read newspapers with a pencil in hand, marking names of judges, candidates, and new commissioners. He sent clippings to lawyers with notes in a precise hand, never longer than needed. He did not sulk. He planned. He understood that succession had to be managed even if he believed he would live long enough to walk out. He favored a setup that resembled a small board. A public face, a strategist, a keeper of rules. Ebola fit the public role. He liked meetings and could absorb a punch in the press when necessary. Katina and Miranda wrapped discipline around him. One with money sense, the other with formality and memory. Beneath them, men like Salerno and Boyardo ran pieces that looked to outsiders, like independent shops, but sent the right shares at the right times. This flexibility made the organization hard to crack. There wasn't one door to kick in. There were dozens, and behind many of them were people who looked like ordinary businessmen. From the medical ward in Springfield, where he spent longer stretches as the 1960s advanced, he could measure the years in new ways. Younger men he remembered as apprentices were now earners. Politicians he had known as staffers now held high office. Federal agencies reorganized, creating new units with fresh mandates, while the old Federal Bureau of Narcotics marched toward a merger that would later produce a larger drug enforcement agency. He kept track without sentiment. He watched, he adjusted, he waited. Above all, he remained what he had always been, a manager of risk. When an associate pushed for a quick score that would bring attention, he said no. When a partner suggested expanding to a new city with a reputation for easy money, he asked who would hold the leash. When a lawyer advised trying a publicity campaign to improve his image, he waved it away. He believed that the only reputation that mattered was the one that moved envelopes. History would remember the 1,959 conviction and the 1,963 hearings as turning points. In between those headlines stood the day-to-day work of keeping a private government alive under public pressure. He took pride in that work, even when pride had to be expressed in small gestures. A nod to a visitor who had done well. A short note approving a solution to a dispute. The simple order that the next meeting be even shorter than the last. He had always said that force should be used sparingly, and that the best kind of power is the kind nobody notices until it has already done its work. From a prison cot, he still believed it. Years had begun to draw a clear line under his life, but the end of the story had not arrived. Outside, the city kept its own pace, unaware of the routines in a distant ward. Inside, he maintained the posture of a man who expected to return to the only job he had ever wanted, deciding where the current flowed. The work would continue without him, if it had to. But for the moment, he was still there, watching the numbers, reading the names, and reminding those who visited that patience could carry a man farther than any headline. He woke each day to the same sequence of sounds: a cart's squeak, a key's scrape, a guard calling names with a voice that didn't rise or fall. The Federal Medical Center in Missouri felt quieter than a regular penitentiary, yet the quiet had weight. He adapted the way he always had, by controlling what he could control. He kept a schedule, shaved with care, folded his shirts precisely, and turned visits into compact meetings where a few words stood in for long explanations. Lawyers brought paperwork, friends brought news, messengers brought the numbers that mattered. He spoke softly, asked short questions, and ended sessions before anyone got comfortable. That rhythm, learned in back rooms and polished through decades, served him behind locked doors, just as it had served him in the most expensive dining room in Manhattan. Outside, the world was changing its tools. After the televised hearings that introduced a national audience to the inner vocabulary of the underworld, federal agencies began to reorganize. New York prosecutors built task forces around labor racketeering, betting, and loans. Washington reassessed laws, making future wiretaps easier to justify and better governed by court orders. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs took shape out of older offices. The pressure felt disciplined now, not sporadic. It did not lunge. It tightened. For a man who valued precision, that method was familiar, and he respected it, even as he worked around it. He never abandoned the legal campaign that had started the moment the guilty verdict was read. Appeals were filed, denied, revised, and filed again. Affidavits appeared with stories of witnesses who had bent under promise or threat. Then other affidavits appeared undoing those claims. A judge might hold a hearing on a narrow point, and then close the door again. Each loss stung for a day, and then was folded into a new plan. The line he offered never changed. The case had been powered by men who traded testimony for relief. He accepted that courts were unlikely to reverse themselves, but he insisted that the argument be made month after month, so that allies on the outside would know their leader had not fallen silent. Leadership by correspondence has limits, but he pushed those limits as far as they would go. He wrote in a small, neat hand, omitting names, referring to people by roles that only the recipient would recognize. He avoided orders. He preferred statements of principle. Keep the money predictable. Avoid flashes that draw attention. Resolve disagreements with arithmetic, not noise. He established a rule for himself about visits from operatives. If a man brought problems without solutions twice, he wouldn't be invited back a third time. The effect was a long-distance culture that mirrored the tone he had set in person. Efficient, unemotional, and alert to risk. News arrived in packages, not only in envelopes. Newspapers came clipped and marked. He read about elections, grand jury impanelments, new district attorneys who promised cleaner docks and straighter contracting, and he noted with a pencil the names of appointees who would matter in the next year. One morning he read that Salvatore Lucania, the old friend the papers called Lucky Luciano, had died overseas. The article gave a short, slanted history, some praise, some scorn. He put the paper down and sat without moving for a long moment. It was a milestone, not because of sentiment, but because a living link to the era that built the current map had vanished. That meant new men out there would feel fewer obligations to old agreements. For an organizer like him, that change had to be accounted for in each decision that followed. On the street, the structure held. Tom Eberly managed introductions, calmed nervous clients, and took meetings that would have been the boss's meetings in earlier times. Michelle Miranda enforced habits that gave the group its spine. Ceremony, rank, default to silence. Gerardo Catena solved math problems, kept heavy businesses steady, and stitched together New Jersey with corridors in Manhattan, so that money moved invisibly over a river that never asked questions. Anthony Salerno developed into a governor of numbers and loans whose smile gave away nothing. Others worked the waterfront, the markets, and the garment trade with a practical eye. From the outside, it looked like a network of small enterprises owned by unrelated men. From the inside, it felt like lanes on the same road. He sent reminders about a subject that had made and unmade him. Narcotics. Street profits had a way of clouding judgment, especially among younger earners who had not watched prosecutors build a case from snippets and whispers. He cautioned repeatedly that any venture in that line required fewer mouths, stronger discipline, and more distance from anyone who might be called to a witness chair. The guidance was not a moral lecture. It was accounting. Every dollar taken in that way carried a tax and risk, and too many men ignored the math. His conviction had taught that lesson more harshly than any memo could. He meant to make sure the memory did not fade. There were still flare-ups that had to be handled. A supplier who enjoyed his role too much began to talk as if he were invincible. He was quietly replaced. A union man whose temper had once been an asset started to bring reporters to picket lines. He was retired to a job that required no speeches. A bookmaker who had grown careless switched his base of operations and found that clients followed the new address without asking why. These adjustments didn't make headlines, and that was the point. He had always believed that the best way to avoid public drama was to act before a crisis arrived, not after. Across town, a different style of leader set the tone in the largest neighboring family. Carlo Gambino preferred the cloak to the sword. He held the throne without theatrics, and he liked deals that never had to be announced. That approach dovetailed with the way the man in prison liked to plan. Their circles maintained peace when profit dictated it, and split edges neatly when two businesses overlapped. The neighbors were not friends exactly, but they were compatible. New York, for a time, felt governed rather than reckless. The labor world kept demanding attention. On the piers, changes in shipping technology began to reduce the number of hands needed to unload cargo. Containers turned chaotic workloads into scheduled ones. Predictability is good for business, but bad for certain kinds of leverage. He had outside managers pivot. If docks would shrink, trucking would grow. If trucking enforced new limits on hours, warehousing would become the pressure point. The men who handled bargaining learned to think 2 steps ahead of new contracts, not just one. City Hall heard less about broken heads and more about zoning and permits. Influence evolved in step with the times because influence that doesn't evolve turns brittle. He never allowed personal grudges to dominate policy. When a familiar name appeared in an unflattering news story, implying that an old rival had whispered to a reporter, he let it pass. He told his confidence that anger was a cost center, and the balance sheet could not afford it. That line was not poetry. It was Instruction. Restraint protected income. Discipline protected structure. Those principles had taken him from the stoops of lower Manhattan to the same table as the most careful men in the country, and he saw no reason to change them now. Law enforcement's patience lengthened. Rather than dramatic raids, agents built cases through ledgers, union bylaws, pension board minutes, and shell company registries. It was a new kind of chess, and it required new counters. Lawyers on retainer studied pension law, not just the criminal code. Accountants learned to keep separate books that would survive a subpoena. A dry cleaner who picked up suits for a dozen properties might also be the person who made small payments to small people who were happy with small favors. The work became detailed and unglamorous, which suited him. A quiet system challenged to remain quiet. That had always been his preference. By the mid-1960s, he had spent years inside, and age began to show itself. Doctors checked his heart and his blood, scheduled tests, adjusted prescriptions, and explained diets. He nodded and followed instructions because health was the first gate to every plan. Even in illness, he kept his habits formal. He starched what could be starched. He walked when he was told to walk. He listened more than he spoke, storing details. He declined lectures from visitors who wanted to praise or condemn him. He had outlived both praise and condemnation many times before. He paid attention to the broader tide. The civil rights movement brought new leaders, new laws, and new enforcement priorities. The federal government poured money into different kinds of policing. Cities no longer looked the way they had in the 1940s. Fresh high-rises replaced old tenements where, long ago, his first deals had been made in hallways that smelled of soup and wet coats. The city he had learned on foot now learned by car, and then more and more by jet. He did not pretend that nothing had changed. He only insisted that human nature had not. And all business, in the end, was built on that. He also watched as old associates faced their own endings. Some died quietly at home, some died on foreign ground, some disappeared. A few faced trials they couldn't beat. Those outcomes confirmed his lifelong belief that the only secure posture is one built on minimal exposure and maximal control. Even from a hospital ward with bars, he still wielded more control than many free men, because he had invested in people and structure, more than he had invested in one idea or one racket. When one channel dried up, others kept flowing. That is the sort of continuity that outlasts fads and storms. Back in New York, a new generation of detectives took courses that the last generation never had. They studied how to trace corporate ownership through layers, how to read cargo manifests, how to watch a numbers bank through utility bills rather than doorways. Those skills made some lanes riskier. He didn't panic, he trimmed sails. A betting bank would move into a real estate office with a legitimate reason to have cash on hand. A Shylock would take on fewer clients and collect over longer horizons, keeping the numbers smaller but the attention lower. The old ambition to build giant, singular machines softened into a preference for many small ones. The gross total could stay the same if the parts multiplied. The hardest internal question at the end of the decade had less to do with money than with the future. He needed to ensure that the shift from boss directing from prison to boss succeeded by a council would not look like weakness. Eboli relished the public role. Katina excelled at keeping the strongest businesses profitable. Miranda cared about honor in a way that kept the rest anchored to tradition. Together, they could hold the center intact and delay rivalries that might otherwise blossom. He had set them up to support rather than compete. That was the last great organizational act he could perform from inside. He did not keep photographs on his walls. He had never liked decorations that spoke too loudly. Instead, he kept notes. He wrote the names of judges with long tenures and district attorneys nearing retirement, of inspectors who were promoted, and politicians who had changed committees. Those notes traveled back to the city with lawyers and found their way into conversations where knowledge itself was a show of quiet power. Half of leadership in his world was memory, and memory could be outsourced only at great cost. As the decade neared its close, his health slipped. The doctors said what doctors say when the body shows its years. Take care. Rest. Do not strain. He did as told on that too. The men who visited adjusted their voices, not out of fear, but out of respect. He maintained the same expression in those final months that he had carried to sit-downs at the height of his power, a look that said he had heard everything and decided what mattered. He did not speak of legacy, he spoke of next week's tasks. On a winter day in 1969, he died at the Federal Medical Center in Missouri. The cause was natural. There were no headlines soaked in mystery, no scenes that required diagramming. He was 71. Newspapers wrote profiles that tried to summarize half a century in a few columns. Some emphasized the violence of earlier decades. Some focused on the courtroom dramas that had followed. Others blended the two and called him the most influential figure of his generation. Friends arranged a funeral with care for privacy. It was a service designed to close, not to celebrate. He was laid to rest, and those who spoke about him afterward did so in the tones of men describing whether they had lived through steady, unforgiving, and a fact of life. What he left behind was not a monument, it was a method. He had shown that an organization could be run like a quiet business, with predictable returns, formal rules, and a preference for order. He had shown, too, that the riskiest profit stream could buy a conviction that no clever argument could dislodge. He had navigated alliances that steered a city away from constant conflict and toward an uneasy, pragmatic peace that kept markets humming. He had lost grandly and won grandly, and much of what he had built carried on in polished, unremarkable rooms where money still seemed to move by itself. After his passing, the men he had arranged to keep the lights on did exactly that. They met, they tallied, they reassigned routes and accounts. They renewed old understandings with neighbors. The city did not blink. Taxis kept their pace. Barges kept gliding down the river. Markets opened before dawn. That continuity was, in its way, the last proof of his approach. He had never wanted a cult of personality. He had wanted a machine that outlasted any one person. The public would attach his name to the family forever, but inside, the point was not the name. The point was the work. He became, in memory, a figure people defined against their own needs. To law enforcement, he was the case study that explained why conspiracy law mattered and why patient investigation could break the most careful ring. To politicians, he was a reason to promise new statutes and better task forces. To rivals or successors, he was the example of a leader who balanced fear and fairness in ways that kept income steady. To the city itself, he was one more layer in a story about power that never needed a speech. If you looked closely, you could see where he had been in the clean lines of a shipping contract, in the subtle carve-up of a distribution zone, in the way a dispute ended with a handshake and a number rather than a broken window. In the end, his life fits into a few plain sentences. He arrived with little. He learned quick. He rose by keeping still, while others made noise. He chose money over glory and control over chaos. He believed in patience more than swagger. He accepted that every choice has a price and paid his in years. What followed his death was the continuation of a system he designed to survive the loss of any one hand. And that, more than any headline or legend, is the legacy he left in the streets that had taught him everything he ever needed to know. The city measured him not only by the years he lived, but by the habits he left behind. To see those habits clearly, it helps to wind back to the rooms where they were formed. Because the last picture, a gray ward, a quiet funeral, hides the work it took to get there. What made him different was not just a taste for control. It was a system that ran on calm, a way of turning pressure into predictability. He did not arrive with that method fully built. He assembled it piece by piece, through a set of choices that turned a boy from a tight, sun-baked village into the kind of man whose name outlived him by decades. He entered New York as an adolescent with a pocket full of words he had not yet learned, and a family that needed him to bring back money every day. Those early seasons were unglamorous and unforgiving. He carried loads on docks, fetched parcels, watched corners, and learned how to read a block without staring. Police notices from the late 1910s and early 1920s show a pattern seen in many immigrant neighborhoods of that era: a weapons charge, a suspicion of larceny, a case dismissed when witnesses hesitated. Nothing about those lines foretold what would come, but they show where the rails were laid. Danger and opportunity lived close together, and if you didn't flinch, you could build yourself room to breathe. When the country outlawed liquor, entire neighborhoods discovered that a law on paper could turn into a gold rush in practice. He aligned himself with other young strivers who thought less about grudges than about margins. Their pitch was simple: Move product, avoid noise, share profits. That meant trucks with timing, speakeasies with steady supply, and routes that adjusted by the week. He earned a place among men who kept ledgers in their heads and carried decisions like unlit matches held carefully until they were needed. He did not make scenes. He took notes without a pencil. The reputation he built in those years was not about toughness. It was about being the man whose answer arrived last and settled the matter. He married young, suffered losses that hardened him, and remarried. Family life touched him at odd angles. Those near him later said he could be generous in private and winter cold in business. The two sides never traded places. He had a son in his household, and also bore the responsibilities of cousins and in-laws, who expected help with rent, lawyers, and small ventures. Counting money and counting obligations were part of the same habit. He never appeared sentimental, but he understood the currency of loyalty in a community where favors built ladders. As the 1920s closed, the market around him changed shape. The city's underworld, once a set of overlapping tribes with inherited feuds, began to be remodeled by ambitious men who treated crime like a corporation. He stood with those who believed that open warfare was bad business. The storm that historians call the Castellamares War. Forced choices. Old bosses demanded worship. Younger men demanded a boardroom. When the smoke lifted in 1931, the old guard had fallen, and the winners created a council to prevent the next bloodletting. He emerged from that pivot as underboss to a leader who preferred strategy to ceremony. His job was to keep income steady, settle disputes with arithmetic, and remind excitable captains that patience earned more than pride. Prosecutors were learning at the same pace. Thomas Dewey's office took apart rackets with a bookkeeper's attention to detail. In 1936, that office sent Charles Luciano to prison on a prostitution case built on testimony and ledgers that put him hundreds of miles from the street in question. That verdict created a vacancy no one could advertise. The organization continued, with the underboss now serving as the chief operating officer in all but name. He saw that the way to keep the machinery turning was to diversify and formalize: gambling downtown, loans uptown, a whisper on the docks, a careful hand in the garment district, a say in produce markets that decided which trucks left first at dawn. Then an old grievance turned into a legal threat. A gambler named Ferdinand Boccia was killed in 1934 after a dispute that mixed money and pride. In time, witnesses surfaced. Ernest Rupolo told detectives that the order came from above, and another man, Peter Latempa, was ready to testify. An indictment followed in 1937. He did not wait for trial. He sailed for Italy, a move that looked to the public like flight and to his circle like prudence. The case would follow him across the ocean. The witness who might have sunk him later died in custody under suspicious circumstances, a death that inflamed commentary and deepened the sense, in the press and police notes, that his reach was long. In court, no one proved who made that happen. On the street, people drew their own conclusions. Italy, in the late 1930s, ran on spectacle and scarcity. He adapted without breaking stride. He bought property near Naples and moved through a world of officials, brokers, and small-time bosses who turned shortages into barter. He did business in the gray zones, introductions, arrangements, a cut in exchange for smoothing a problem. When the war overturned everything, he presented himself to Allied officers as a man who spoke both languages and knew the terrain. Records from the time show him assisting in translation and local logistics. Other files and later articles depict him siphoning profit from black market channels that sprang up wherever food and fuel were scarce. Both portraits joined his name, and neither entirely erased the other. With the war underway and American prosecutors still interested in him, the tide shifted. U.S. authorities arrested him in Italy and returned him to face the old Boccia indictment. The case against him collapsed in 1946, when the key witness was no longer available to testify, and remaining evidence felt thin to the court. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, a result that said as much about timing as about innocence. He returned to a New York that remembered him and, in quiet corners, had been waiting for him. The city he re-entered was a diplomat city, if you knew where to look. Union bosses shook hands with ward healers. Judges attended fundraisers where envelopes did not look like bribes but like tickets. Gambling houses kept soundproof doors and polite doormen. He rebuilt his circle the way a draft horse steps back into harness steady, without flourish. He rewarded men who had kept his interests alive while he was away. Gerardo Catina with his careful books. Mike Miranda with his emphasis on order. Tony Bender-Strollo with his talent for persuasion. Tom Eagle-Eye with his smooth touch. And younger earners like Anthony Salerno, whose numbers business turned nickels into rivers. His world differed from Frank Costello's in temperament. Costello's strength lay in influence and restraint, in keeping narcotics at arm's length and politics close. He wanted a wider board, with every profitable lane under supervision and taxed discreetly. Witnesses and police memos from the decade that followed tied his name to tolerance of heroin profits in a way that would later become evidence. He was not reckless about it. He tried to build a wall between retail and leadership. That wall would hold only until the government learned how to map whispers. Before that reckoning, he had to resolve a leadership question at home. Two visions of the business competed, one built on alliances with City Hall and old friends in politics, another built on forceful management across every revenue stream. For a while, he played the long game, absorbing and outlasting. When the stalemate threatened to become permanent, the deadlock broke with a shot in a lobby. Frank Costello survived, chose retirement, and left the field to the man who had waited so long to claim it. Police arrested a young associate who had grown up around the boss, a one-time boxer who beat the case after a wobbly identification. The message needed no clarification. The transfer of power had moved from rumor to fact. His focus swung beyond Manhattan. To keep the peace, he needed to manage relationships with other families whose stakes matched his. Carlo Gambino understood subtlety and valued it. Their approaches meshed. Albert Anastasia was different, effective, and feared, but combustible. According to later investigative accounts and testimonies, a coalition grew around the idea that Anastasia's reign could not last without bleeding money. In a midtown barbershop, that story ended with a sudden flurry. No trial ever put names to the plot in a way that stuck. The result, though, rearranged the map again and elevated Gambino, which in turn steadied the bond between the two biggest houses in the city. He wanted to seal these shifts with a national meeting that would impose order and stop public embarrassments. Instead, the meeting humiliated him. Appalachian made the network visible to everyone with a television or a morning paper. State troopers boxed in a country estate. Men in tailored coats sprinted into the woods. The scene turned whispers into proof for a skeptical public. The fallout tightened laws, emboldened prosecutors, and embittered allies who thought the summit should never have been called. He absorbed the blame without complaint and went back to work, because income still had to be delivered on schedule. The narcotics conspiracy case that followed in 1000, 958 and 1000. 959 was the echo of a dozen private choices he had made in the previous 10 years. Street dealers turned witnesses. Couriers explained routes. A central witness tied lines on a map to names in a ledger of memory. The jury believed the web and not the denials. He was sentenced to a term long enough to take the rest of his middle age. Even in defeat, he looked prepared for it. He had already arranged managers, already taught preferences, already set the posture that would survive his absence. Inside federal custody, he ran the only kind of leadership possible: slow, quiet, and selective. He accepted that every conversation might be overheard later in a courtroom. He traded specific names for roles. He kept principles simple: avoid spectacle, keep books clean, settle disputes with credits and debits. The men on the outside who liked speeches learned quickly that there would be no speeches. There would only be results. A counselor who liked ceremony reminded people that rituals exist for a reason. A treasurer who liked neat columns kept debts clear and payments punctual. An ambassador who liked ties and cufflinks kept friends friendly and rivals wary. The Valakai revelations in 1963 did not create trouble for him so much as they confirmed trouble already looming for everyone. The public learned a grammar for talking about the underworld. Agents learned how to build conspiracies that fit that grammar. Jurors learned to see a pattern in behaviors that had once looked like coincidence. All of that made his kind of business harder and his brand more famous. He adjusted. He trimmed exposure, slowed growth, and shifted money toward fronts that could answer questions without stammering. He also lived with the costs of power. Associates who had protected him in one era became liabilities in another. Tony Strollo's disappearance in 1962 is a chapter that sits in police files like a dark stain. Theories abound. Few facts do. The people who knew the reason never discussed it with reporters. The gap that remained had to be filled with a replacement who could persuade without being seen. That is harder than it sounds, and it shows how thin the margin is between calm and chaos in a network that depends on secrets. There is a practical way to describe his primary lines of work, and it tells you why he rose. Gambling provided constant cash and predictable mathematics. Bookmaking turned statistics and habit into income. Loans filled the gaps for businessmen who couldn't go to banks, and for gamblers who had lost too much at cards. Labor racketeering did not mean owning a union. It meant owning the pressure points around it. Dispatch boards, stevedore lists, warehouse slots, delivery schedules. The waterfront taught him timing. The garment district taught him distribution. The produce markets taught him how to make first, inline look honest. In each space, he preferred to be the person who solved problems. People pay for solutions. That posture outlasted fashions and elections. It bought him decades. He took care to seed legitimate fronts, restaurants and bars, vending routes, moving companies, small real estate holdings, because each gave him a reason to be somewhere and to see someone without explanation. A jukebox operator calling on a bar could, in the same visit, collect a debt. A moving truck parked on a block could, while loading, handle an introduction. These were not exotic tricks. They were ordinary uses of ordinary businesses to keep private business private. That is why the organization kept its balance, while the headlines raged. He also confronted the burden of allegations that never made it to verdict. Journalists and defectors attached his name to plots that remained unresolved cases where a critic of foreign dictators was killed on an American sidewalk, where a corrupt official rose too quickly in a city newly occupied by Allied forces, where a witness in an old case met an abrupt end. The responsible way to tell those episodes is to mark the line between accusation and proof. Prosecutors did not convict him for those acts. The rumors clung anyway, because they fit the pardomations portrait that had grown around him. A planner who preferred invisible solutions and who considered silence to be the most reliable insurance policy. The contradictions in his life were not unique to him, but he embodied them. He could donate generously to a parish, and in the same month pressure a wholesaler to sign an unfavorable contract. He could lend support to a politician who promised better streets, and also arrange for a union list to favor a friendly contractor. He valued manners and could issue hard instructions with a voice that never rose. People who expected a show were disappointed. People who expected a decision got one. His last years showed how much of his power had come from ritual. He ate at the same time, read the same pages, shaved with the same care. Those habits were not affectations. They were armor. In a world where surprises kill deals, predictability saves them. When he died, the machine he had organized did not seize up because it had not been built around a single voice. It had been built around a set of practices that could be taught. That was his greatest talent, and also the reason his name would be attached to a family long after his family was burying him. There are pieces of his story that carry lessons beyond the underworld. One is that institutions, legal or illegal, reward the same qualities: attention to detail, calm in the face of pressure, and a willingness to let others claim the spotlight while you assign the roles. Another is that shortcuts that pay today may present a bill years later under fluorescent lights. He won large and then lost large, because he allowed a hot line of profit to mingle with the cool ones he preferred. Agents built a case from threads and gossip embers. A jury believed the tapestry. He went away and never walked out. If you were to list what he did in the plainest possible terms, the items are cold and simple. He helped run bootlegging during the dry years. He managed gambling, policy, and loans through a network of rooms that stayed open while the city slept. He exerted influence over unions that controlled how and when goods moved. He taxed businesses under the table so the table could stay upright. He facilitated arrangements overseas when war broke the normal channels. He was indicted in a homicide and fled, then returned to see the case collapse. He rose to lead the most influential crew in New York. He was linked by law enforcement to narcotics traffic and, in 1959, was convicted for conspiring to move heroin through the city. He ran his house from a cell as long as his body let him. He died in federal custody, the most famous prisoner of his kind. The rest is commentary. How he did it without theatrics. Why he treated anger as a cost. Where he placed his trust, when he decided to act and when to wait. Those details explain why the story of his life still reads, to some, like a manual for quiet power, and to others, like a cautionary tale about hubris that does not announce itself until it is too late. Either way, what you learn from him is the same lesson you learned from the city that made him. The loudest noise is not always the most important sound, and the real work happens in rooms where the only thing you can hear is a chair being pulled closer to the table. Files and rumors only carry a story so far. The rest lives in quiet rooms where a few people speak in low voices and then leave by different doors. To understand how he lasted as long as he did, you have to step into those rooms one at a time and watch how he turned messy street trades into orderly income. He did it with routines. He did it with discipline. He did it by seeing risk where other men saw only a score. He knew the city's games from the inside out. The numbers racket, which started as a neighborhood pastime, became a dependable river once it was organized. Small bets moved through candy stores, barbershops, and newsstands, then climbed stairs to bank runners who counted with swift hands. Policy bankers wrote the figures on slips and sent the totals up by early afternoon. In East Harlem, a stout earner with a hat pulled low, Anthony Salerno oversaw much of it for him, making sure bettors were paid when they won so faith stayed high. A soldier named Michael Coppola, sharp-eyed and quick to act, helped turn that business from a neighborhood scheme into an operation with schedules, collectors, and ledgers. The point was not glamour. The point was reliability. People trust what pays on time. Gambling brought the same logic to back rooms where dice tapped and cards fanned. A house that knows its math does not need to cheat. It needs quiet, a steady crowd, and protection from sudden inspections. He supplied those pieces with careful agreements. Doors were watched. Phone calls were short. A lawyer's number sat near the cash drawer in case something went wrong. When someone forgot the rules, when a dealer started drinking too much, or a runner talked when he should have listened, the correction was swift and private. Rooms stayed open because problems never became headlines. The waterfront taught him a different lesson. Control the list, not the dock. The dispatch sheet for longshoremen decided who worked and who waited. If that sheet ran through hands that respected his instructions, cargo moved on time, with fewer quarrels, fewer delays, and fewer calls to supervisors who might have ideas about reform. He didn't need to own a union to shape outcomes. He needed to influence bottlenecks, hiring halls, delivery schedules, warehouse doors. He let others take the microphones at meetings. He took the envelopes that arrived on Fridays, and he used them to keep order. The same principle applied in the garment center, where delivery routes could make or break a small manufacturer. Trucks that moved early and safely were worth bribes disguised as fees. That is how small pressures, applied in the right place, looked like efficiency to everyone else. He learned that the produce business could be made to look like a symphony. At dawn, when the market buzzed, a vendor who fell out of favor might discover that the best stalls were suddenly taken. Another buyer, who paid his dues with accuracy, found his crates at the front, fresh and stacked. Inspectors who saw more than they needed to see might receive a call from higher up inviting them to focus on other streets for a while. All of these minor adjustments felt like luck to the casual observer. Inside, they felt like reminders that order requires a hand on the wheel. There were episodes that keep showing up in files and footnotes because they cut to the center of his reach. The old Boccia murder case, sparked by a quarrel over a crooked deal, followed him to Italy and back. The witness list carried names that made him nervous. One of them, Peter Latempa, died while awaiting trial under government protection. The official story said unnatural causes. The street story said that silence had been purchased at a price. Courts never pinned that death on anyone, and no indictment claimed he planned it. Still, people carried the belief that he could adjust outcomes from a distance if the stakes demanded it. Belief like that is its own kind of force. Italy gave him a stage where his talent for finding the useful line between two worlds paid well. He spoke both languages. He understood local customs. When Allied forces took control of southern cities, He offered himself as an interpreter and a guide. He helped arrange trucks, introduced officers to mayors, and identified men who could be trusted to keep order in chaotic streets. Soon, investigators inside the military began to suspect that he was doing more than interpreting. In a hungry city, food, fuel, and medicine had black market prices, and anyone who could move them could profit. Reports from that time, some signed and some hearsay, tied his name to deals that turned scarcity into currency. He was arrested on black market charges by American authorities in 1944, and then shipped back to face the old homicide indictment. When that case dissolved in 1946, he stepped into daylight without a charge sticking, a result that sharpened his air of inevitability. Back in New York, there were political ripples that colored his world. Frank Costello had threaded influence through city clubs, judges, and ward leaders, using advice and introductions more than threats. He could call a commissioner and resolve a problem without a raised voice. That was not the only way to run a crew. The man who had just returned favored standardization and breadth. Gambling, loans, labor pressure, distribution routes, and, controversially, a tax on narcotics profits. He did not want chaos. He wanted a large map with clear borders. That clash of models didn't erupt in public until 1957, but everyone in the business felt it as soon as he took a booth for himself again. There is a smaller story hidden inside the larger one about his household. His first marriage ended in grief when his wife died in the early 1930s. He remarried. Years later, his second wife filed papers in court, making claims that mixed anger with fear. She said she had married under duress, that he kept a hand on every part of her life. For a moment, it looked as if a divorce case would pull family matters into open court, where they would be examined by strangers. Then the case faded. Papers were withdrawn, testimony softened, and the file closed. No criminal charges grew out of that dispute, but it added another shade to his public portrait. A man so commanding that even domestic disagreements looked like business. The allegation that he stood behind political violence in the Italian immigrant world in New York also follows his name. In 1943, an outspoken editor who criticized both foreign dictators and the men who praised them was shot on a Manhattan sidewalk. The case has never been solved. Over the years, investigators and writers have argued that the killing was arranged by figures with strong ties to Italy's secret police and carried out with help from underworld intermediaries. His name appears in some of those arguments because of his wartime position in Naples and his habit of trading favors among men who spoke the same dialect. Law enforcement never charged him with that murder. The matter remains in that gray space where rumor, motive, and opportunity swirl without landing in a courtroom. The narcotics question, which ended up defining his last decade, began as a calculation. Heroin profits in the 1940s and 1950s drew a line down the middle of the underworld. Some leaders refused it outright, saying that the heat would burn down everything built on quieter trades. Others, including him according to witnesses and police files, believed that control could make even a risky trade manageable. The supply chain at the time ran through Europe and the Caribbean. Opium products moved into labs around Marseille, where connections linked Corsican brokers to American buyers. From there, shipments reached New York by ship and plane, sometimes routed through Montreal or Havana, sometimes carried by couriers who looked like tourists and felt like actors in a drama they didn't fully understand. On this side of the water, distribution ran through teams who knew Harlem and the Bronx block by block. They collected, cut, packaged, and delivered. The money climbed in steps. The leadership taxed it and protected it. In 1958, the chain broke where it often does, at the low end, where risk is highest and loyalty is thinnest. A courier named Nelson Cantelops decided to talk. He told a federal grand jury about meetings, routes, codes, and payments, and he named the men he said were above him. His picture was neat enough for a jury to follow. It placed the boss at the top of a network that had rules, managers, and scheduled collections. Defense lawyers attacked his character and his motives. They showed contradictions. They reminded everyone that he had made a bargain with prosecutors. The jury still believed him. In 1959, the verdict arrived, and with it, a long sentence and a fine. He went to Atlanta and then to a hospital prison. insisting to the end that the case had been built on the bargains of liars. Even inside, he kept teaching the same approach he had learned as a young man. Avoid noise, reward predictability, punish carelessness, and make sure every man knows what his share island. Associates on the outside enforced those expectations. Gerardo Catena took care of New Jersey's heavy accounts, trucking, warehouses, construction materials, and made sure that the people who needed to be calm were calm. Michelle Miranda kept traditions intact, flattening disputes before they turned into grudges. Tom Eboli met the kind of people who felt comforted by a handshake and a glass of wine, and left those meetings with promises that were kept. Anthony Salerno, without fanfare, kept numbers and loans humming in East Harlem and the Bronx. The aim was continuity. If your system keeps paying, people are less likely to risk it. Pieces of the older story continued to shift, even after he disappeared behind gates. A friend died quietly overseas and was buried far from New York. A one-time ally, once erratic and dangerous to secrets, was silenced in a New Jersey restaurant, a message to anyone who thought loose talk could be excused by past service. A flashy leader across the river who solved problems with speed rather than patience fell in a barber chair, and the balance of the city adjusted to a more careful hand. Each time, he showed no public interest in revenge or celebration. Each time, he turned events into structure. Law enforcement changed tactics at the same time. Instead of chasing headlines, agents began to study pension boards, corporate charters, lease agreements, bank deposits, utility patterns, zoning variances. They learned, case by case, how influence travels without a gun. That meant the old tricks hiding a betting bank in a candy shop, storing loan records in a tailor's press, needed to be replaced by fronts that could answer hard questions. He approved. If you could look a regulator in the eye and offer a clean invoice without stumbling, you bought time, and time is profit. He studied names as if they were chess pieces. He kept lists of commissioners, port directors, council members, and assistant prosecutors. He knew which ones were ambitious, which ones were tired, which ones were honest on Monday, and more flexible on Friday. He never needed all of them. He needed a few who understood that small favors now could become great friendships later. Donations to local clubs, support for charitable drives, quiet help with a relative's job application, these gestures were investments. They paid dividends in silence when silence mattered most. The strain inside a house like his always runs in the same place, between tradition and change. Older captains valued ceremony, remembered who had backed whom in the early 1930s, and drew lines around neighborhoods as if they were family prayers. Younger earners saw the world shifting under their feet with container ships, interstate highways, and new laws. He calmed both sides with the same promise. Profits would be shared, and nobody needed to fight for scraps. For as long as he supervised, that promise held. When sickness pinned him to a hospital bed, the promise held because he had spent years turning it into a habit. A short list of episodes sits at the edge of the record, hard to prove, easy to imagine, and still argued about by historians. One has to do with bribery in the years between his return from Italy and his final conviction. Whispers that he offered sums to reduce court pressures, stories that never hardened into indictments. Another concerns the way certain witnesses recanted, unrecanted, and then refused to speak at all. The public hears these as legends. The men involved knew them as whether unpredictable, dangerous, and something you simply prepare for by staying out of it as much as possible. He instructed his people to avoid scenes that required explanations, emails that could be copied, conversations that could be replayed by someone else's memory. When he died in 1969, the obituary writers struggled to fit half a century into a handful of paragraphs. Some described him as a calculating executive of crime. Others painted him as the chill wind behind the late 1950s war on narcotics. A few tried to balance the two and wrote about a man who loved order and found a way to impose it on markets built on disorder. The truth is large enough to hold all three. He built, managed, and profited from gambling, loans, union pressure, distribution rackets, and assorted business schemes that flew under the law. He was suspected and sometimes credibly linked to witness tampering, violent solutions to disputes, and long-distance meddling in family matters and civic affairs. He was convicted only once, and that one time erased his last decade of freedom. He ran what he could from a cell, the way he had run it from a corner table, sparingly, precisely, and without speeches. His influence did not vanish with him. The methods continued. Meetings happened at times that made sense. Men left with assignments that fit their skills. Rivalries settled into math rather than street theater. Later bosses would wear different suits and use different words, but they would inherit the machine he had tuned. A network that made money by turning raw fear into something that looked to outsiders like efficiency. That is why his name clings to the institution long after the person is gone. It is less a label than a design. People sometimes ask what the lesson is, as if a life like his could be trimmed to a single sentence that fits a lecture. The closest thing to a lesson is this. In any system, legal trades or illegal power belongs to the person who makes uncertainty go away. He did that for decades, sometimes with harm that courts could not reach, sometimes with order that even critics admitted made workdays smoother for people who never knew his face. He leaves behind a record that repels and fascinates in equal measure, because it is built from choices that found profit in the cracks and costs in the shadows. He knew both sides and kept his balance longer than most. His story is not only about deals struck and verdicts read. It is about the way a city bends around a presence it cannot see. It is about late nights where whispers decide the next morning's shipments. It is about a man who understood that patience, more than nerve, wins the long game. He began as a boy, glaring at an ocean he could not name. He ended as a leader whose signature was invisible, but whose effects were felt in every neighborhood that woke before dawn to move goods, count slips, or load a truck. In between, he wrote a long, quiet ledger, in which every entry had two columns, what it earned and what it risked. He lived by that math until the end. In the years after he was gone, the city kept unwinding the knot he had tied, strand by strand, and finding his fingerprints in the pattern. The picture that emerged in courtrooms and hearings was not a tale of daring capers. It was a ledger of pressure points, hiring halls, dispatch lists, gambling rooms, cafes where envelopes changed hands, and companies that looked ordinary until a prosecutor pulled their papers apart. What law enforcement called organized crime had been, in his time, a set of habits and relationships. After his death, those habits kept paying dividends for men who had learned them under his eye. The most obvious heirs were the managers he had put in place while he was serving time. Tom Evil Eye became the public face for a while, smiling in restaurants and settling disputes. Gerardo Catina kept the core businesses steady in New Jersey. Michelle Miranda guarded traditions. Anthony Salerno grew from neighborhood earner to a man whose say carried weight beyond his block. That spread of roles looked deliberate because it was. He had built a board, not a throne. The board persisted, though it shifted as the decade turned. Federal law changed the ground under everyone. In 1970, Congress passed a statute that let prosecutors describe patterns of racketeering and hold leaders responsible for the ongoing way a group made money. That law, used at first with caution, became a central tool against the kind of structure he had perfected. It turned a series of small acts into a single picture for juries to consider. The shift owed something to the trail he left. Investigators had studied him for so long that they finally learned the value of patience. They stopped looking for dramatic scenes and started connecting routines. The first major blow to the house that bore his name landed in court after he was gone. But it grew out of managers he had trained. Frank Funzi Thierry emerged in the early 1970s as a leader who could sign off on big decisions without drawing a crowd. He spoke softly, wore plain suits, and preferred restaurants where waiters knew him by first name and asked no questions. In 1981, he became the first top boss in New York, convicted under the new racketeering law. The case reached back through labor pressure, loans, and skims that looked, to a jury, like parts of the same machine. He died later that year, but the precedent remained. The government had found a way to put the blueprint on trial. Before that verdict, the public saw a murder that echoed the old days. In 1972, Tom Evil was shot on a Brooklyn street. Investigators later argued that he had fallen out with another powerful leader over money and promises he couldn't keep. No case pinned the killing on any one person, but the message did not need a signature. The position he had filled required a survivor's instinct and a treasurer's caution. He had one, and lacked the other. The chair he occupied did not stay empty. It never did. But the circle tightened, and men counted their risks more carefully. New Jersey, always a vital part of the map for the house he had built, saw its own storms. Ruggiero Richie the Boot, Boiardo, the old line baron whose word had organized Newark and its suburbs for decades, aged into the role of legend. His son, Anthony Tony Boy, rose and ran into the newer legal tools and zealous prosecutors who now understood how to pry into trucking firms, construction yards, and labor locals. The cases of the late 1970s and early 1980s revealed how deeply the family had sunk its roots into bidding for public jobs, asphalt and concrete deliveries, and the timing of shipments. The lessons, good and bad, traced back to the man who had taught everyone to prefer leverage over spectacle. Another strand of that legacy showed up at dawn on the waterfront, and at markets where buyers and sellers have argued since the first crate was unloaded in New York. In the early 1980s, a case centered on the city's fish market documented how stall assignments, truck access, and protection money could be managed without anyone needing to shout. The names on the indictment were not his, he had been gone more than a decade, but the method was unmistakable. Those who controlled bottlenecks controlled outcomes. Courts, equipped with the racketeering law, learned to treat those quiet pressures as one story rather than a collection of unrelated favors and fees. By then, the man once caught in a lobby with a bullet grazing his head had retired to his garden. Frank Costello, the old rival, lived long enough to watch the new law fulfill what he had warned. That open association with narcotics would bring a flood the business could not withstand. He died in 1973, outliving both his friend-turned-rival and many who had cheered for one side or the other. Their contest had carved the underworld's path for a generation. The bills arrived on all sides, paid in prison years. Through the 1980s, two names defined the public face of the house he had given his name to. One was Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the East Harlem earner who had spent decades turning small bets into steady money. In 1986, federal prosecutors unveiled a sweeping case that accused the leadership of New York's main families of running a council that fixed construction contracts and divided profits from large markets. Cameras followed Salerno into court. In that era, agents believed he was the top boss. Jurors heard about a concrete club, about controlled bids, about phone calls that never mentioned crime but still revealed coordination. He was convicted and sentenced to a long term. Years later, agents and defectors said he had been a decoy, a man who absorbed attention while another ran the show. That other was Vincent, the Chin Gigante, the lanky kid who, decades earlier, had been accused of waiting in a lobby when shots were fired at Costello. In the 1980s and 1990s, he perfected a public act that sent reporters and even some judges in circles, dressing down, shuffling in bathrobes, missing appointments on medical grounds, and presenting himself as unfit for trial. For years it worked. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, cases tied him to bid rigging, labor racketeering, and control over industries he had learned to value when he was a young runner in the old boss's circle. In the 1990 Windows case, federal prosecutors charged leaders from multiple families with fixing city contracts for housing repairs. The man on the throne stayed off the indictment, but his lieutenants did not. Later, the act unraveled. Tapes, witnesses, and long investigations produced a racketeering conviction for him in the late 1990s. He died in federal custody in the 2000s. The arc felt familiar. Quiet power, patient law, slow fall. If you ask why the framework lasted, look at how it handled politics and unions. In his day, a ward boss might take a call from a union leader and smooth a problem with a judge over lunch. In later decades, that same result required quieter steps. Donations moved through clubs. Relatives found jobs. Board seats on pension funds became as valuable as the union cards themselves. The late 1980s cases laid out, in dry testimony, how a longshoreman's dispatch sheet and a mason tender's meeting agenda could decide the fate of millions in contracts. The line from those exhibits leads straight back to rooms where he once sat without raising his voice. There is another thread that runs through his story into the modern era, the marriage between local crews and overseas suppliers. In the 1950s, the chain pointed to Europe and the Caribbean. In the 1960s, 970s and 1980s, new networks built similar pipelines through different ports and different partners. Other families took the lead, but the logic had not changed. The boss who had gone to prison in 1959 insisted that structure could make a dangerous trade manageable. Later police work, international cooperation, and massive cases would suggest otherwise. It turned out that secrecy could not keep up with the scale of the profits. The more people involved, the easier it became for one voice to unspool the whole story. Memory did not confine itself to courtrooms. Journalists, historians, and even the occasional novelist tried to capture what it had felt like to be in those rooms. Some painted him as a villain with a spotless tie. Others found in him a cold executive who, had he been born above board, might have run a bank. The truth sits somewhere between caricatures. He was not a philosopher of crime. He was a manager whose gifts fit a particular city at a particular time. When readers approached his life looking for glamour, they found logistics. When they looked for chaos, they found schedules. That mismatch explains why the legend glows while the record reads like a filing cabinet. The arguments never stopped around a few episodes that feel like loose nails on a finished floor. Did he order the death of a witness while the man was sitting under government guard? No court proved it, but many people inside and outside law enforcement believed it. Did he play a role from abroad in settling scores in the Italian-American press in New York during the war? The files suggest motives and opportunities, not verdicts. Did he quietly influence which local officials got a gentle call and which did not in occupied Naples? Records and memoirs conflict. The discipline of telling his story is to mark every line that says alleged and every line that says convicted, and to note the distance between them. What is certain is the way his life changed the way the government worked. The witness who broke in a prison yard in 1962, convinced that he had been marked for removal, gave the country its first public vocabulary for understanding the structure behind city whispers. That moment, combined with state troopers interrupting a country gathering in 1957, taught the public to think of organized crime as an institution. From there followed witness protection programs, long undercover assignments, and grand juries that stayed open for years. If you follow the chain, it runs from a Lower East Side stoop in 1913 to statutes and units and tactics that still shape investigations today. He did not ask to be remembered as a lesson. Yet the most useful way to think about him is as an instructor who never stood at a podium. He taught by example that a crew could be run like a company, with rule books, budgets, and succession plans. He taught, by severe mistake, that short-term profits from a risky trade can undo decades of careful work. He taught that coercion wears out when it is not softened by predictability, and that predictability is valuable enough that people will pay to experience it. None of those teachings are noble. All of them are real. A look at the criminal docket of New York across the decades frames his legacy in numbers. In the 1930s, prosecutors measured success in counts against single defendants and occasional conspiracy charges that covered a few men at most. By the 1980s, a case might name 20 people and read like a corporate chart, with arrows showing flows of money, instructions, and favors. The old boss's life sits at the fulcrum of that change. He forced government to learn his language just to argue against him. When people talk about him now, they often talk about silence. His sentences were short. His meetings were quicker than the meals that accompanied them. He did not indulge in speeches. That quiet was tactical, but it was also personal. He had seen early that a city full of talkers makes room for the man who listens and decides. That is why his name still floats through stories about the families that came after him. The method outlived the man because it did not depend on charm. It depended on restraint. Think of the streets he walked at the start. Tenements, docks, a market where dawn feels like a bell ringing. Think of the offices he forced into existence. Prosecutor suites with special units, a Senate chamber hearing about a hidden counsel, judges issuing opinions that explain how small acts can add up to a pattern. He moved from one world to the other without ever leaving the first. In doing so, he changed both. That is what history calls influence, even when it would prefer a more heroic word for the people who wield it. There is a temptation, in late chapters, to tidy everything up. That would be untrue to his life. He ran a machine that dealt with human appetite and fear. Machines like that are never neat. They grind. They throw sparks. They require oil. He knew that and never pretended otherwise. He kept his part clean: the suits, the schedule, the rules, so that the inevitable mess never made it to the table where decisions were made. He was not a mastermind in the romantic sense, and he was not a brute in the simple one. He was a man who found, in a harsh city, a way to sell order. The price others paid for that order: workers missing a step on the ladder, small owners squeezed by fees they could not name, families torn by addiction, funded by profits he taxed, shows why the story cannot be told as admiration. It can be told as instruction and as warning. What remains, so many years later, is a map with lines he drew. The names inside the boxes have changed. The laws on the books have grown thicker. The technology has made secrecy harder and public records easier to search. Yet the underlying lesson a young striver might have picked up from him in 1925 is the same one a detective might learn from studying his cases in 2025. Structure wins until it doesn't, and the difference between winning and losing often comes down to whether you can see the risk in the thing that looks, at first, like the best deal in the room. He would have understood that coda. He had lived it. He had enjoyed long years when the math worked and the phone stayed quiet. He had paid in years when the witnesses talked and the judges believed them. He had arranged a succession so the machinery would function after his last day. In that sense, he got what he wanted. The work continued. The city kept its pace. And those who came after him, both in his world and across the aisle in the government building, used the lessons he left, each in their own way. Long after his name stopped appearing on mail, it kept echoing in rooms where men counted cash and measured promises. You could see it in the way a meeting began on time and ended early, in the way a disagreement turned into a math problem instead of a scene, in the way a junior man learned to listen more than speak. That was his lasting fingerprint. It didn't glow like a sign. It lived in habits. To understand the full shape of it, you have to follow the lines that ran out from his life into the decades that followed, and also circle back to details that explain how those lines were drawn in the first place. He had started with the most basic of underworld trades and turned them into steady businesses. Numbers play, which many treated as a pastime, became a grid that crossed neighborhoods. Small bets at a newsstand turned into envelopes, a runner handed to a banker who settled up by supper time. That reliability built respect. He showed crews how to turn card rooms into quiet rooms. He taught that a steady house does not cheat. It creates a setting where regulars feel safe and keep coming back. Everything else, watching doors, tipping the right cop, knowing which nights to go dark, was housekeeping. Those principles outlived him because they were simple enough to teach and strong enough to last. Labor influence was quieter but more powerful. He showed that a hiring hall list was more valuable than a headline, that the man who controlled the order in which trucks left a warehouse often decided who made a profit that week. On the piers, that meant cargo moved with fewer fights and more envelopes. In the garment center, it meant one contractor got pickups at 10, and another, who had refused a fee, waited until 3. In produce markets, it meant a stall spot on the floor could make or break a season. None of that looked cinematic. It looked like a city running on time. That was the point. Not all of his footprint was in New York. He extended reach through men who worked New Jersey's turns and bridges. Ruggiero Richie the Boot, Boiardo held court in Newark's orbit for decades, solid and rooted. His world connected trucking firms, construction yards, and union locals that set the rhythm for whole counties. That was a version of the same map he had drawn in Manhattan. Bottlenecks, schedules, envelopes. Later, as the government learned the routes to pry open companies with subpoenas and conference room testimony, the old design showed itself in the paperwork: shells, leases, salaries that looked normal until you followed them for 3 pages. The story of influence inside the Teamsters belongs here too. Anthony Tony Provenzano ran Local 560 in New Jersey, with a rough hand wrapped in a smile. He worked within the family he had served for years and made himself a figure who could deliver labor, peace, or turbulence, depending on what the moment asked. He developed ties to national union leadership. When courts came calling in the 1960s and 1970s, he collected convictions for extortion and related offenses, and later faced accusations, never proved in court against him personally, that tied him to the disappearance of a famous labor leader in 1975. Prosecutors never charged him with that act, and he died in prison on other counts. Yet the line that led to him loans, trucking, hiring, pension boards, traced back to a system set in place long before, when the boss in New York taught men to see pressure points where others saw only jobs. Alongside the structure sat the list of episodes that kept investigators awake. The 1934 killing of Ferdinand, the Shadow Boccia, grew from a dispute that turned deadly in the old style, part pride, part money. The indictment that chased him to Italy in 1937 named him as the man who ordered that hit. He left before trial, returned in custody years later, and watched the case collapse in 1946, when a key witness died under protection, and the rest of the proof seemed too thin. Ernest Rupolo, who had once implicated him, turned up dead in 1964, after he had tried to balance both sides of that story. No courtroom ever put the full sequence on record. The street drew its own conclusions. There is the wartime chapter that refuses to close itself neatly. In Naples, he helped American officers navigate a battered city, translating, arranging, connecting. Those same months produced black market profits for men who could move food, fuel, and medicine. He was arrested by American authorities in 1944 on charges tied to that market, held, and then sent back to face the old New York murder case. The government did not win a conviction on the black market complaint, and the Boccia indictment failed. What remained was a portrait of a man who could step between worlds and find a way to be useful to both, which is another way of saying he could find a margin and live inside it. The allegation that his influence reached into Italian-American political feuds in New York during the war years lingers like smoke. An editor who attacked fascists and their friends was shot on a city sidewalk in 1943. Investigators traced motives to people who admired dictators abroad and to fixers who disliked noisy critics at home. Over time, some writers tied his name to that story because he was in a position to trade favors and because he had a habit of smoothing problems. Law enforcement never charged him with that killing. The matter remains in the gray zone where history keeps questions and the living keep their own answers. A domestic scene, so different in tone from the rest, gives another angle. His second wife took the rare step of speaking to officials and lawyers in the early 1950s about money, control, and her wish to leave. She owned bars and clubs in the village and, according to reports at the time, told a state panel that her husband had boasted of earnings far beyond anything on a tax return. The case shifted, softened, and settled into silence. No criminal charges followed from her statements. The public learned, however, that the man who avoided microphones might still be dragged into the light when the problems were at home. Even that flash of life outside the ritual and the rules became part of how people would tell his story. He had believed he could fence narcotics with structure. That belief, more than any single choice, cost him his last decade outside. The route from Marseille to Manhattan grew smoother in the late 1940s and 1950s, and the money was vast. He preferred to tax rather than touch, to authorize rather than carry. Prosecutors built a case that said authorizing was enough, that a man at the top who took profit and offered protection shared in the responsibility for every link in the chain. Witnesses testified, maps were drawn, and in 1959, the verdict sent him to federal prison. That chapter, unlike so many others, ended with a stamped judgment. From inside, he managed a careful delegation. He did not name a single heir. He built a board. Tom Eboli shook hands with restaurant owners and suited men in hotel lounges. Gerardo Catena watched ledgers and warehouses and truck schedules and made sure the markets did not seize up. Michelle Miranda preserved the bones of the institution's ceremony and rank because rituals do more than decorate. They keep arguments from becoming schisms. Anthony Salerno ran numbers and loans with a courteous manner that never distracted from the totals. These men kept a structure humming even while their leader saw it through glass and bars. His death in 1969 looked quiet from the outside. Inside the world he had built, it triggered what it was designed to trigger. Nothing dramatic. Positions adjusted by inches. Routes stayed assigned. The dock lists moved. In Newark, the old family steered by Boyardo kept to its lanes. Across the river, Carlo Gambino's even hand steadied the larger balance. The absence of noise was proof that the method worked. That calm did not stop time, though. Time ran its own program. In the years that followed, the government refined tools that he had, in effect, forced it to invent. Witness protection became formal. Long undercover assignments grew more common. Task forces stitched together agents from different agencies so that labor fraud, bid rigging, and loan sharking could be seen as parts of one picture. Then came a law that changed the game. Racketeering statutes let prosecutors pull a decade of small acts into one chart and call it a pattern. In the mid-1980s, the case that made the point famous put leaders from the city's largest families in the dock together. Anthony Salerno, the numbers boss from East Harlem now wearing the title of top man, stood among them. Jurors heard about controlled bids and a club of construction firms that paid for the privilege of predictability. Salerno was convicted and sent away. Later, informants and surveillance tapes convinced investigators that he had been a front for Vincent Gigante, the gangly runner from the 1950s who had grown into a strategist with an odd public act. Gigante turned evasiveness into an art, shuffling through his neighborhood in a robe, missing court dates with doctor's notes, and presenting a public image of confusion that bought him time. Behind the scenes, he used the same levers his old boss had prized: unions, routes, markets, and the polite threat that a late payment would make business inconvenient. In the 1990 Windows case, federal lawyers listed city contracts for public housing repairs that had been sliced and assigned like pastry. The documents showed coordination across families. Trials followed. Convictions piled up. In the late 1990s, tapes and witnesses broke through the act, and Gigante was convicted and sent to federal custody, where he died years later. His end mirrored the older man's, not with a show, but with a steady legal process that turned patience against him. Other Genovese leaders cycled through in those decades: acting bosses, street bosses, counselors with soft voices and long memories. Liborio, Barney. Bellomo Rose fell to a racketeering case, then resurfaced. Dominic, Quiet Dom. Cirillo acted as a low-profile advisor and faced his own charges. Daniel, Danny the Lion Leo, took a turn as acting boss before indictments pulled him off the board. Enforcers and managers in New Jersey like Tino Fiumara kept an iron grip on waterfront and construction rackets into the 2000s, bringing a kind of continuity that would have pleased the man who valued steady money over spectacle. Each of these names appeared in papers as proof that the family had not evaporated with its founder. Each also proved that the government had learned how to make time an ally in dismantling pieces of the old design. Markets that had been his favorites kept drawing indictments. The Fulton Fish Market, a bustling city inside a few blocks, became the focus of cases that detailed how stall assignments and loading schedules were sold behind a curtain. The carding industry, invisible to most and essential to every store and restaurant, was exposed in the mid-1990s as a cartel that rested on padded bills and quiet threats. Cases against corrupt officials in the carpenters and mason tenders unions laid bare how meeting agendas and pension board votes could be commodities. In each file, you could see the method that had been born in his era. Control the choke point. Call the prophet. Order. He did not create the city's hunger for that kind of order. He satisfied it and then taxed it. That is why his name, separated from the person, became a kind of brand. When a later boss wanted to sound old school without making noise, he borrowed the posture. Short meetings, early exits, no boasting, a ledger instead of a speech. When a prosecutor wanted to explain to a jury why 20 small acts amounted to a single story, he pulled a chart that mapped onto the way this man had taught his house to move. When journalists wrote about the old time, they used his life as a frame that turned individual incidents into a narrative about structure. People still argue about the measure of him, whether he was an organizer with the instincts of a banker or a predator with a good tailor. The record shows pieces of both. He made illegal businesses safer for the people who ran them, and more expensive for everyone else. He preferred persuasion to demonstration, but he lived in a world where final decisions sometimes ended in disappearance. He tried to keep narcotics at a distance, then accepted its profits, and lost everything outside because of that acceptance. He believed that discipline could fence danger. He found out that some kinds of danger jump fences. There are small facts that pull him out of legend and back into a room. He kept tidy. He saved clippings. He wrote notes in a neat hand. He tracked the names of mid-level officials with more care than the names of mayors, because mid-level officials decide more things. He believed that meetings were shorter than people thought they needed to be, and that the most important sentence in any meeting was the last one. He taught those habits until they felt like instinct to the men who worked for him. Habits like that outlast monuments. The city has a way of folding every life into itself. It took him in as a boy, gave him alleys to race and ships to unload, and introduced him to a world where a favor could pay rent faster than a wage. He rose by noticing where delays began, and by putting a price on ending them. He held power for a long time by refusing to show it off. He fell when a jury believed a story about a network that carried both drugs and money. He died in a room with a clock on the wall and a guard at the door. The men he trained kept the machinery running until the machinery met a new kind of pressure that could not be bribed, threatened, or ignored. And still, in small ways, the shadow remains in how deals are kept clean on the surface and complicated underneath, in how people who prefer quiet find one another and trade favors that do not need names. That is the curve of his story from start to finish. A boy who learned to listen, a lieutenant who mastered order, a boss who built a board instead of a throne, a prisoner who directed by principle when details became dangerous, a legacy that spread through routines until it became hard to tell where the man ended and the method began. The crimes he committed or authorized filled columns bootlegging and gambling, labor racketeering and loans, tax schemes and extortion, suspected witness interference and alleged involvement in violence, conspiracy to traffic narcotics proved in court. The influence he pressed on the city filled the spaces between those lines, markets that ran on time but at a cost, unions that moved to a rhythm that wasn't only about workers, companies that looked normal until you asked who chose their customers. The last word belongs to the city, as it always does. The streets he walked as a young immigrant are still there under new paint. The markets open before dawn, and trucks line up the way they always have. People still look for someone who can make a problem go away for a price. The law still looks for ways to make that price too high to pay. He sits between those facts, not as a ghost, but as a pattern proof that a person can change the way a place works without ever standing on a stage, and proof, too, that even the best designed system can be broken when the wind turns and patience shifts to the other side of the table.